I want to continue on this PowerPoint about China and the sort of challenges it faced. One of them was, of course, from Western culture, Western influence. So some people came up with an idea. How will we meet this challenge? If you remember last time we were talking about General Yuan. When he dies in 1916, China is in turmoil. It has Western powers that are controlling much of the coastline, much of the infrastructure. It also has Japan, which is growing as an imperialistic power. And we see that some people are calling for a new cultural movement. Things should change. They believe that they should do sort of what the Japanese were doing, become more, sort of use Western methods, but try not to become Westernized. So some of the intellectuals who live in the main city, Peking or Beijing, started what is called a new cultural movement. They began to teach Western ideas in the classrooms, ideas about science and democracy, which get a kind of a nickname, Mr. Sci and Mr. Day, Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science. And this was the idea that they thought that they could turn to a science, technology, and democracy on the political side, and this would help China achieve and move forward in the 20th century. Now, most of the people in China, many people in China, were illiterate. They were not intellectuals, certainly, and they didn't live in the large cities, and this movement really meant very little to them. If they even knew about it, they didn't think it would do much for them. Well, in the aftermath of World War I, we see a picture here of the main negotiators in the Paris Peace Conference. You see right there in the center is Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States at the time. Germany had territory, and of course remember in World War I Germany was defeated. So the German territory in China, instead of going to China, to Japan. This upset many of the students in China, especially students. It upset other people too, and they began to demonstrate in Beijing. So in the 1920s then, there appeared to be sort of two ways in which you could approach this. A nationalistic way, nationalistic party, or the Communist Party. You're going to go for communism, or you're going to go for nationalism. Sun Yat-sen was a Chinese nationalist. He was pro-democracy, and this approach that I just told you about, by sort of using Western methods but maintaining their unique Japanese culture. The Chinese, unique Chinese culture. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was the sort of other alternative. This was going to follow more the model of the Soviet Union, the rather newly formed Soviet Union. So communists in China, we start to see that that there are communist radicals in 1921 at Peking University or Beijing University, and they begin this party. So they begin the CCP, the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. The CCP will turn to Lenin, the guy pictured in the lower left side of the screen, the person who had orchestrated the communist takeover in Russia and saw the eventual emergence of the Soviet Union. And one of the problems in China, not only did they have sort of Western influence, Japanese influence, but they had warlords, internal warlords. So in 1923, they began to work against the warlords. By the summer of 1926, there was a northern expedition, it's called, begins. And this is really when the revolution, the communist revolution in China, takes its full measure. Revolutionary forces who were strongest in the north, especially with the peasants in the north, began to take all the land south of the Yangtze River. And they did this by the spring of 1927. Now, of course, part of this was, I suppose, aided in the fact that the leader of the nationalist movement, son, dies of cancer in 1920. His protege, Chiang Kai-shek, will be now the leader of the nationalists in China. Chiang Kai-shek then begins to move against the Communist Party of China, CCP, in April of 1927. So here is Chiang Kai-shek, the new face of the nationalist movement in China. Of course, on the other side, we have Mao Zedong. He is pictured here as he looked in 1925. So, in fact, in 1928, a Chinese republic is formed under Chiang Kai-shek. This is the government, the new government of China. There are radicals or revolutionaries in the north, and those were some of the main threats that they faced. But unfortunately for Chiang Kai-shek, not the only one. They had the communists in the north. They had, of course, Japan, a growing imperialistic power just offshore, and now with territory in China given to Japan that was once land controlled by Germany. Many communist leaders are killed in 1927 as the Chinese nationalists are exerting their power, and that's what brings rise to this new leader now, Mao Zedong, who comes into full power in 1927, and he will rule the Chinese Party and eventually China until the 1970s. Well, here's a picture of Mao looking a little more the way we usually see him, with his worker's cap, much like Lenin had done in Russia. He wears a worker's cap, and here we see Mao in 1936. He wanted a revolution of the poor peasants. He, in fact, was not poor, much like Lenin was not poor. He was a son of a prosperous peasant in the southern part of China, but his main base of power is in the north with poor peasants, many of them landless. Now, remember that the Communist Chinese Party and the Nationalists had teamed up for a while, interestingly enough, to fight against the warlords and, of course, to try to counteract what the Japanese were doing. But in 1927, any sort of idea of an alliance ends, and this is when things really begin to heat up. Chiang Kai-shek wants to get rid of all the Chinese Communist Party leaders. So, Mao will flee to his base of operation in the hills in 1931, and this is in the north. Here he will organize all of his followers, all of his revolutionaries. Here's another picture of Mao in the 1930s. Here he is with Chou Enlai, who is sort of his right-hand man, Chou Enlai, and they lead what is called the Long March. So in 1934, Mao's People's Liberation Army, as he calls it, the PLA, is forced to flee and move northward. This is called the Long March. Chiang Kai-shek has this success, and he wants to build upon it, but he has little success in building his republic, Mao still is very powerful in the north. And of course, at about this time, you've got the buildup to World War II, because we're into the 30s now. And this will be the age of dictators in Europe, the age of people like Stalin. He's in the upper left, of course Hitler in the upper right, and Mussolini in the pictured at the bottom there. France and England will keep their democracy, but they too also have strong rulers, as does the United States, with the longest serving president in our history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who keeps being reelected. He is the reason why Congress passed a law limiting the terms of president. They'd always only served 2 terms, sort of maximum. Roosevelt had served, was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms, although he didn't make it much through his 4th term. But Congress then passes a law which limits the president's term to service to 2 terms, which would be a maximum of 8 years. But there is totalitarian rule in Italy, Germany, and Russia. And of course, Germany and Italy are fascist, and Russia, they are communists. Now, these totalitarian rulers expected obedience and active loyalty. In 1924, Lenin, the guy that we just talked about, who was involved with China, he dies in 1924. And this leaves then this new fledgling Soviet Union, which had only been together for a few years, without its founder. So the question then comes, who is going to lead? And this becomes a difficult and violent, bloody struggle between 2. There are others, but it focuses down to 2 main ones. Trotsky, the guy pictured here in a sort of montage or collage of several pictures of Trotsky. He had become a hero militarily and had gained a lot of support. And then Stalin, who was sort of the insider, political insider. They struggled for 4 years. Stalin wins, and Trotsky is exiled in 1928. By the way, he ends up in Mexico City. If you want to know what happened to Trotsky, well, he ends up shot in the head in Mexico City. Most people believe assassinated by agents of Stalin. Stalin would then try to change the Soviet Union's economy, and he begins what is called the 5-year plans, his first 5-year plan. Mainly, this 5-year plan was to do 2 things. It was to industrialize, or make the Soviet Union, into an industrialized nation. It really was not industrialized at this point, but he desperately wanted that so that they could become a military powerhouse, heavy industry, shipping, so forth. And of course, to do that, you need money. And the problem was the Soviet Union's money really wasn't worth anything. It had very little value outside of the Soviet Union. So he needed hard currency. He needed Western currency. How was he going to get that? Through collectivization of agriculture. So here is a famous portrait of Stalin. By collectivizing the agriculture, that is, taking small farms, having the government take them over, tell those farmers this is no longer your farm, tear down the sort of fences in between it, make huge fields, have all those farmers then work for the government to farm these huge fields and huge farms. So the land is seized, huge farms. The peasants, of course, the farmers, Many of them resist this because this is their land, and they are brutally met with force, slaughtered many times. And so finally, the government then controls the farming, the land, and what crops are grown, and the selling of those crops. So there's a lot of sales of those crops, which actually puts many of the people of the Soviet Union hungry, because Stalin is willing to sell this to get the hard currency, to get the Western currency. He uses then these profits to build his factories and to industrialize the Soviet Union. But millions of peasants starved to death in the process. Now, along with this, of course, Stalin, a brutal ruler, will begin what are known as purges, the purges of Stalin. These begin in 1936. Who is it that gets purged, and what does it mean to be purged? Anyone who opposes Stalin, or anyone who is rumored to oppose Stalin. So you could be turned in by your neighbor, somebody down the street, somebody at work might overhear you say something or do something that they think is disloyal. This would be reported. Soldiers, police would show up in the middle of the night, say 2, 3 in the morning. They would come into your home. They would drag you out and haul you away. And you would never be seen again. That's basically what the purge is. Where would you end up? Well, in a place much like pictured down here at the bottom. You'd be in a work camp. Some people were shot, killed, taken to a place and shot. Others were sent off to prison camps, which are called gulags, many of them in remote areas like Siberia. So you could be arrested really for anything that could be said that you were disloyal. And might be something you said, something that you didn't say, might be something you did, or something you didn't do. It really didn't matter that much. And so people lived in fear. Even officers and members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union were also found themselves arrested, sent off to work camps, or shot. So this was, Stalin was a complete takeover. He didn't want any rivals. If we move from the Soviet Union to Italy, we see that Italy had a democracy, but it was very fragile. Many different factions and political parties. The Communist Party was a strong party, and this many people were fearful. So it seemed to be the only option, or the only two options, is to go with a Communist Party or to go with a sort of fascist nationalistic party. World War I, how it ended, Italy felt that they would get a better deal because they had not joined in with the Germans, and they had joined in with the Allies, and they thought they might get some land or some money or something. They really didn't get anything, almost nothing. They were promised land, but they didn't receive it. This made many people upset, disgruntled. They felt like Italy had been slighted, taken advantage of. Most of the land that they wanted was this land up here to the right of Venice, over in this area here of what became Yugoslavia. So that land they thought would go to Italy. It did not go to Italy. It went to a newly formed sort of composite country called Yugoslavia. So many people believe that 600,000 Italians who died in World War I had really died for nothing. Maybe they should have stayed out of the war altogether. So this made people very discouraged, and they eventually were looking for someone who could bring back sort of honor, or bring back respect for Italy. They found this man, or this man found them. His name was Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, in many ways, serves as the inspiration for Hitler. He was sort of Hitler's hero, because he did what Hitler eventually does a few years later. And of course, later on Hitler becomes more powerful than Mussolini. But he begins, that is, Mussolini begins a fascist party. But he began as a socialist. But he founds the fascist party in 1920 in Italy. By 1922, he had 300,000 members. And so really, Italy then becomes the first fascist state with leadership by Mussolini, who takes on the title the leader, El Duce, the leader. And so, again, this serves as a kind of model of something that Hitler's going to do, well, I don't know what, maybe about a decade later, 8 or 9 years later, Hitler's going to follow the same kind of model. Well, what are these principles? What is fascism? And what are the principles of fascism? Here you see Mussolini up on a balcony looking out over thousands of people who are there to hear him, see him. Well, one of the principles of fascism is, and it's all about the state or the nation, that you can only really find fulfillment as an individual, as a person, through the state, serving the state, that sort of thing. You should be willing to sacrifice for the state. That should be your service. You should be willing to do anything for the state to advance it. The other idea here is struggle. Life is a struggle. Life is difficult, and so you must be willing to struggle. And sort of the highest form of struggle in life is warfare. Another key element of fascism is the idea that the state, the government, needs a strong leader, someone who will lead and guide and embody the nation. And that's, of course, what they had here in Mussolini. The idea is related to the one that says that nations are sort of like living things. They're living things. And so if you're not growing, if you're not developing, then in fact you're dying. And so this is the idea that we must move forward, we must advance, and so forth. These are all the principles of fascism, as seen in Mussolini, and of course will be repeated and even to a greater extent by Hitler in Germany.